Full moons bring revelation, illuminating what's been building, simmering within, culminating in storylines, bringing issues to a head that have been developing, bringing things into more illuminated visibility and awareness, sometimes to startling effect in terms of the events and experiences that arise under the light of the full moon or the crucial insights they deliver. This will especially be the case with the Scorpio full moon on May 12th, as it illuminates the great depths of the sign of Scorpio while further activating the liberating Promethean force of Uranus. Hey, I'm Greg Crawford. I'm a professional astrologer. I've been in practice for the past 2 decades, and my books are currently open for astrology consultations. I'm going to put a link below in the description so you can book a session with me. This full moon in Scorpio is very potent for three main reasons. Number one, the past period of time has just been simply incredibly intense and amplified with the extraordinary change that has erupted all around the world in current events. And this has also been happening in our personal lives. This is because of all of the incredibly activated, change inducing astrological cycles that all coincided in the past few months. These include Mars retrograde, Venus retrograde, Mercury retrograde, two powerful eclipses, Neptune entering the sign of Aries. And in the past month, we've had Venus finally stationed direct at the past full moon in Libra about a month ago. Since that past full moon in Libra, Venus has been moving direct. She came back into the sign of Aries at the end of April. She formed a conjunction with Neptune and Aries for the first time in our lifetimes in the beginning of May. This was a big deal because it brought all the deep inner changes that have been going on in our lives and all the external changes in our relationships and creative direction and everything else that we've been experiencing into contact with this new sense of reality and ideals and inner dreams that is beginning to develop now that we are adjusting and getting used to this new quality of Neptune being in this fiery sign of Aries. At the same time, at the end of April, as we came into the recent new moon in Taurus, Mars came back into Leo and formed its third and final opposition with Pluto. These three oppositions with Pluto have been going on all the way since last November in 2024, and due to them correlating with this great retrograde cycle we went through with Mars stationing retrograde in Leo, coming back into Cancer at the beginning of 2025, stationing direct in Cancer towards the end of February, and then finally at the end of April coming back into Leo and finishing off the third opposition with Pluto. This went with all sorts of huge events that have been going on in the world, but in our personal lives, this has also brought great change. And for some of you, this will really vary person to person and circumstances, but in one way or another, you've likely gained greater clarity now for how things have been changing. And with the recent new moon in Taurus, there has been this sense of generating some momentum with better clarity about how things have been changing. This full moon in Scorpio is illuminating the larger depths and ramifications of all these internal changes that have been going on and how they interact and interrelate and correlate with the circumstances of our lives that are changing dramatically as all these great changes are going on all around the world. This is just a very powerful time in general. And so this full moon is really going to illuminate the way our stories have been changing. The additional factor then is within a week of this full moon, Pluto stationed retrograde on May 4th, just as Venus was coming into form her third and final sextile aspect with Pluto that's been going on since February. And it's been an aspect that was just part of all the great changes happening with the Venus retrograde transit in March and April. And so, with these depths of Pluto being intensified in the week leading up to this full moon, it's likely that all sorts of new revelations and insights, new layers of deeper change are coming into your awareness. Sometimes these big changes that happen during eclipses and Venus retrograde and Mercury retrograde, sometimes they're really obvious at the time. Sometimes our circumstances dramatically change. Sometimes we just aren't able to do what we were hoping to do. And then we start finding the reason, what's the deeper meaning for why this hasn't worked, and how does this relate to the way other things are changing in my life. So it sometimes just takes time to take in all the self-realization. And so this full moon in Scorpio is likely to illuminate greater awareness and understanding for the way things are changing and how to move forward. The second reason this full moon will be very powerful, especially in terms of great revelations and sudden changes and new momentum and movement, is the fact that it is activating Uranus in Taurus. The full moon in Scorpio is applying to a close opposition with Uranus in Taurus. There's been a number of these full moon in Scorpios opposing Uranus in the past 7 years, ever since Uranus entered Taurus in 2018. There's even been total lunar eclipses in Scorpio opposing Uranus. This aspect of Uranus being in the exaltation of the moon and being triggered annually every year by these full moons have been part of the way Uranus have brought great change. And sometimes when these full moons come into contact with Uranus, we just get this deeper layer of revelation. For some people, there can be very dramatic events happening in their lives in correlation with that creates a sudden change. For other people, it's not like a big dramatic life event always happens when the full moon opposes Uranus, but it does tend to bring this deep illumination, these revelations, these sudden awareness of things that are changing and new insights into your surrounding relationships and just what you're planning. The other thing, because Uranus can be a wild card and it can sometimes go with unexpected events that are disruptive and very sudden and not the kind of thing you can really plan for. It's also just good to be aware of this general time period around the full moon. There could be things happening out of your control that bring some disruption or sudden change. It's not something to get a lot of anxiety about, but just something to keep in mind if you notice things getting a little bit more extreme or fast-paced in one way or another in ways that you weren't necessarily prepared for. The fact, though, that Uranus is in the end a great liberating force, a planet that can go with great innovation and invention and breakthrough ideas, I really do love the fact that it's being activated at this time, because there have been all of these eclipses impacting Saturn moving through Pisces, as well as the Venus retrograde impacting Saturn, as well as the Mercury retrograde impacting Saturn. Mercury and Venus have now moved away from Saturn, but Saturn recently has still been very close in contact with the north node of the moon. And so we've been getting this very amplified, intensified relationship and presence of Saturn in our lives. There's good things that can come with Saturn, but it can make us feel constrained, or it can bring up scarcity complexes. It can make us feel like a lot of pressure is coming in, the walls are closing in one way or another. Saturn does tend to reduce things or create some sort of obstacle or pressure you have to contend with or work through. And so the fact that this full moon in Scorpio is forming a flowing trine with Saturn, as well as opposing Uranus, and Saturn and Uranus are still in range of a supportive sextile with one another, I do really hope that you will experience this sense of insight and creative solutions and ideas that help you move through whatever types of challenges or pressure or adversity you've been experiencing recently with Saturn. The third reason this full moon in Scorpio will be very powerful is that the moon has her fall in Scorpio. The moon has her fall in Scorpio because Scorpio is the opposite sign to Taurus, where the moon is exalted. This means the moon is brought down to her depths, and it brings us down into the depths of our psyche and emotions. And we can feel things more intensely when the moon is in Scorpio in general, and especially when we have a full moon in Scorpio. So the fact that we have this deep, penetrating full moon in Scorpio that can really pick up all the emotional material going on around us, and it's opposing Uranus and activating Uranus at the same time, this brings up the theme of catharsis. And so this could be an extremely cathartic full moon in Scorpio. This means that emotions that you may not have been aware of, realizations about different things going on in your life you may not have fully been aware of, or just not fully emotionally come into contact with, those types of things could come up. But in case you do need to purge and release emotions or extra layers of grief or loss that you hadn't fully gone into contact with, the combination of everything going on with this full moon and a type of catharsis that could come about with it ultimately can be purifying. And that purification of release of these emotions could ultimately help you gain greater clarity and understanding, and ultimately lead to more recentering and coming into relationship with where you are now and what you need to do next and what you need to change. This is a chart for the full moon in Scorpio in Washington, D.C. And in Eastern time zone, it's going to be taking place about 12:55 p.m. on May 12th in 2025. As we can see in Washington, D.C., with the sun and Uranus up close to the midheaven and that full moon in Scorpio down on the bottom of the chart, it looks like a full moon where there are likely to be some big events happening related to the United States of America on the global stage. But of course, you don't need me to tell you that, as there are so many things going on in current events related to the United States right now. But it is pretty amazing how powerfully the timing of this full moon is showing up on the angles in Washington, D.C. So, as I was just talking about, the real key aspect to pay attention to with this full moon in Scorpio is the fact that the moon is applying to that opposition with Uranus that you can see here. But at the same time, as the full moon culminates and then moves through that opposition with Uranus, the moon will immediately form a flowing trine aspect, a watery trine aspect with Saturn in Pisces. And so there is a very interesting connection here where we're getting a very dramatic, catalytic, potentially disruptive, or just potentially propulsive and activating aspect with Uranus that could bring sudden change, big leaps of thought and a revelation, as I've already talked about. But then the moon immediately comes into this flowing trine aspect with Saturn. And so, what I really like about this combination is that we can get these big ideas and innovative solutions. And hopefully, we can then combine that with that ability of Saturn to ground and center and take account of the limits of our circumstances. How much time and resources do we truly have available so that we can come up with innovative, realistic, inventive ideas, inventive breakthrough ideas that we can really actually manifest and bring into reality and lay down structured plans for steady growth towards those big ideas that we may receive at this time. And so it's a great full moon just to be tracking the ideas you're developing, doing any kind of brainstorming. I think there's a lot of potential for very large, long-term visions of change and big ideas to develop that could emerge here that we may not fully understand how to bring into reality right here. But as long as there's a potential to do that and we can start structuring and laying down a plan for that, that trine with Saturn can be very helpful. And again, this can relate to all the challenges and all the big changes that we've been experiencing recently. The other thing to note about this trine between the moon and Saturn is that we're coming to the end of our time with Saturn in Pisces. We've had Saturn in Pisces since March 7th of 2023. And by the end of this lunar cycle that we're in, Saturn will enter Aries on May 24th. And that is the biggest astrological event of the month. That doesn't happen right here. That happens about 2 weeks after this full moon. And so here we may also be getting big revelations and insights regarding our experience with Saturn in Pisces since March of 2023. And so it's a good time to start reflecting and contemplating the way things have changed, the challenges you've faced, the way you've grown and matured with Saturn in Pisces. And we will then be starting to get ready for Saturn to come into Aries as this lunar cycle wanes and comes into the next new moon in Gemini that will come later towards the end of May. The other big aspect building with this full moon is a flowing fiery trine between Venus in Aries and Mars in Leo. The reason this is so important is the moon is in Scorpio, that watery home of Mars. And so Mars in Leo is the lord of this full moon. The full moon is separating away from a square aspect with Mars as it moves into this full moon. And so it's not like the full moon is building into the square with Mars, but that square with Mars is in the background and the back storyline of this full moon. And so in the days leading up into the full moon, there could be something upsetting or disruptive or some kind of challenge you just have to face, some kind of strife you have to contend with or manage, or just something that's very activating you need to deal with and you need to respond to and take action on, something related to Mars. And whatever that is, it's going to be part of what generates the big insights and growth and illumination that comes with this full moon in Scorpio. Although that may sound intense, this lunation's not as intense as what we were going through back earlier in the year with Mars retrograde and Venus retrograde, Mercury retrograde, the eclipses. There still is a lot of change happening with this full moon, but it is not going to feel as chaotic in general, all things being equal for most people, as those previous eclipses and lunations that we were having in March and April. One reason for that is the fact that Mars is now moving direct, is now clear of the degree range where Mars is moving back and forwards retrograde, and Venus is also moving direct. And she is getting really close to moving past the degree where she originally stationed retrograde at the beginning of March. In fact, she'll do that about 3 days after this full moon. And so we are really tying up in many ways a lot of the major changes that have come in with the Mars retrograde and Venus retrograde periods. And at the same time, Venus is now moving direct and getting brighter in the sky, moving faster in the sign of Aries, in that fiery home of Mars. And she has a flowing, harmonious trine aspect with Mars in Leo. And so hopefully this can be a point of integration. And it's one of the reasons why I think there can be very helpful, innovative ideas coming in here to deal with whatever challenges and change you've had to contend with in the first part of 2025 with Mars retrograde and Venus retrograde, because they are now moving direct. They are coming into this harmonious aspect. And during the waning half of this lunar cycle, they'll be getting closer and closer to forming the exact trine aspect. And they will do that on May 22nd, towards the end of this lunar cycle. And so it gives the whole lunar cycle, the waning half of this lunar cycle following this full moon, some extra fire and fuel for motivation and making progress with whatever you've been working on. I really love the aspect of Venus being in harmonious aspect with Mars, because it feels more like the kind of thing where if you are facing competition or needing to really strive for something, it can be that sense of healthy competition that pushes you to get to the next level of whatever it is you're working on. And because we're talking about Venus, we're talking about relationships. We could be talking about very inspiring collaborations or very supportive friends or just teamwork or just big ideas, lots of social connections and busyness and getting together with other people, sharing ideas really sparking and setting off projects or things you could work on with other people. There's this sense where Venus is coming in here in a supportive way with Mars and should be helping to lessen the types of conflicts we've had with Mars that might have been more evident earlier on in February and January and March and April when there was this more intense Venus retrograde, Mars retrograde combination. And as I mentioned, we're also still adjusting to Neptune being in Aries. And now that Pluto has stationed retrograde in Aquarius and Venus is moving away from a conjunction with Neptune and away from a sextile with Pluto, I also think this full moon is going to help illuminate the way things are already starting to change with Neptune in Aries and whatever might have happened in correlation with that for you when Venus came into contact with Neptune earlier in this lunar cycle in the beginning of May. If you'd like to see some of my ideas about the meaning of Neptune in Aries, I have made a video on my channel that you can watch. And as I've mentioned, the biggest astrological event of this month and the waning half of the lunar cycle to come following this full moon is the entrance of Saturn into Aries. That will happen on May 24th, 2 days after that exact trine between Venus and Mars forms. So there's something about that trine between Venus and Mars, which is correlating with this final pass of Saturn going through Pisces this time around. I'll have more to say about the meaning of Saturn in Aries in a subsequent video. But Saturn changing signs is always a major deal. It brings a whole new set of activations in your chart. If you look at your chart in a whole sign house system, it's activating a whole new area of your life, and a whole new set of life topics becomes intensified by this pressure of Saturn. Saturn brings great change. And it is the type of change, though, that takes time. Now that we've come to the end of our first experience with Saturn in Pisces, you likely have a much better sense of the deep ways Saturn has brought change into your life through its movement in Pisces. And so that, again, is something that this full moon in Scorpio is illuminating. But it's also important to keep in mind that while things will start changing in new ways with this entrance of Saturn into Aries, it's going to be more of an initial jolt and activation of new storylines and change. And then in the beginning of September, on September 1st, Saturn will move backwards into Pisces again. And we will experience a final time of Saturn being in Pisces from September 1st of 2025 into February 13th of 2026. And so we're not done with the entrance of Saturn into Pisces yet, but the entrance of Saturn into Aries will be a major change coming at the end of this lunar cycle. And so there's something about this full moon in Scorpio that's also bringing crucial insights that are going to end up leading into the way our life changes with the entrance of Saturn into Aries. Like I said, I'll say more about this movement of Saturn into Aries in another video, but because we're talking about Aries and this fiery cardinal nature of initiation and change, and the fact that Neptune is already in Aries waiting for Saturn, we can expect there are going to be some very dramatic changes and developments on the world stage. And we're also going to have some important shifts and change happening in our personal lives. And so ideally, this revelatory full moon in Scorpio is going to help set the stage for this and give you some important ideas that are going to lead into ways that your life is going to change and hopefully help you in some innovative ways with those changes by the time we get to the end of this next lunar cycle. Another meaningful symbolic layer of the Scorpio full moon is that it is taking place in the third decan of Scorpio. The decans are 10-degree segments of each zodiac sign, so that in every 30 degrees, There are 3 decans, 10 degrees each. Since the Scorpio full moon is happening in between 20 degrees and 30 degrees of Scorpio, it is in the 3rd decan of Scorpio. The decans are ancient. They go back to ancient Egypt and have been used as a calendar system as part of magic. And they carried through into the Hellenistic astrology era and beyond. There's a rich tradition of both magical use and divinatory use of the decans in the tradition of astrology. And they also became connected eventually into the divination system of the tarot, especially in decks such as the Rider Waite deck, illustrated by Pamela Coleman Smith. The 3rd decan of Scorpio is associated with the Seven of Cups arcanum, illustrated by Pamela Coleman Smith. The 3rd decan of Scorpio is also the face of Venus. In this image, we can see a shadowy figure looking into a foggy visage of various 7 chalices, each filled with a symbol of a different type of desire, whether that involves lust or power. While each of the 7 cups holds an image of desire, there is a central figure, a veiled figure glowing crimson red, very much a veiled symbol of Aphrodite. As this is a face of Venus, the 3rd decan of Scorpio is a decan in which we must come to terms with the essential desires driving us through experiences of loss, decay, gain, and growth that draw us into the heart of the matter. And the heart of the matter in this image, although all 7 cups hold an image of desire, we can see in the center a central image of a veiled figure, glowing red, very much a veiled form of Aphrodite or some other embodiment of central desire. Some interpret this image as signifying that through discernment, we may choose to follow the one desire that will bring the clarity needed to make choices aligned with our true, authentic inner values and desires. But certainly, this image speaks to the great changes and flux and loss of desire, emergence of new desires, and potential confusion regarding desires that you could have felt over the course of the past several months with Venus retrograde, Mercury retrograde, and eclipses, as well as Mars retrograde. And now that this full moon is activating Uranus, it speaks to this ability to gain revelatory insight into the heart of the new desires that could be emerging. Or if you are dealing with loss of desire, that putrefaction, that laying to rest and death of the desire can lead to a regeneration and transformation of your desires in ways that will bring new life and clarity and growth. This is one of the meanings that Austin Coppock brought to this decan in his book, 36 Faces. And in fact, he called this decan a face of liberation, which speaks very well to the fact that this full moon happens to also be activating the liberatory force of Uranus. He wrote that through the loss of unfulfilled desires, this process of separating our desire from the external objects they were attached to brings the ability to reseed and regenerate our core desires in enlivening ways. Coppock wrote that this 3rd face of Scorpio, like I said, is a formula of liberation. For, quote, if we were not capable of laying our desires to rest, returning them to pure energy, we would be enchained forever, prisoners of what we once held dear. This speaks to the profound ability of this Scorpio full moon to break us free from whatever processes of loss, death, putrefaction, catharsis we have been going through in recent months, into contact with the primal new desires that are beginning to take root and flow forth through us. Or it may, in fact, be more of a place for some of you of loss and catharsis and expressing this purgation of desire that can help lay them to rest so that new desires will now begin taking root. Whatever the case may be for you with your personal story, I love this image for speaking to the potency of the Scorpio full moon, activating Uranus for helping us to lay to rest all the great changes and potential loss and shifting of desire you have experienced in recent months. And as we lay those old patterns, those old desires to rest, we can come into deeper contact with the new desires and the new creative directions now emerging. I'm going to now go through a short delineation for each zodiac sign in relation to the Scorpio full moon. You may find this delineation most meaningful in relation to your ascendant sign, although it may also speak to other important placements in your chart, especially your sun sign and moon sign. Scorpio. Scorpio, I'm starting with you because this full moon is all about you. You have gone through great changes during this whole first part of 2025 because the Lord of your sign, Mars, has taken you on a great inner journey and quest of some sort or another. Mars began the year retrograde in Leo, soon shifted back retrograde into Cancer, stationed direct in Cancer, and finally came back into Leo last month and back into your 10th house. And now, as we come into this full moon in Scorpio, Mars in Leo is finally moving forward. It's finally broken free from the opposition with Pluto. It's finally broken free into new zodiacal degrees and new zodiacal terrain in the sign of Leo, which is your 10th whole sign house. And so this full moon is going to illuminate so much about who you are and who you've become over the course of these recent months with Venus retrograde, Mercury retrograde, the eclipses, Neptune changing signs, and everything else that's been going on, as well as who you are in the world with your work and your actions and the roles you take on. And it also has a lot to do with the roles that you are in service to. What is that vocational path of devotion and whatever sorts of inner talents and skills or character that you are in service to, that you are so passionate about, that you bring it into your daily work and effort. All sorts of insights can be emerging for you at this time. Now, of course, you've had Uranus and Taurus in your 7th house for a long time at this point. You've likely gone through some major changes or just big illuminations about yourself related to relationships or exciting developments coming in through relationships of all sorts ever since Uranus has been in Taurus. And so this full moon is also illuminating some sort of deeper awareness about this, as well as the fact that that full moon in Scorpio is applying to a flowing trine with Saturn in Pisces. Ever since Saturn entered Pisces in March of 2023, Saturn has been moving across your 5th house. Now, if you have children or work with children or the topic of children in some ways, there's many ways that the adversity and tests, as well as maturation and growth you've experienced with Saturn and Pisces has related to this in some way. But the 5th house also has a lot to do with our creativity, our pleasures, our passions. And you have such a powerful creative drive. And this past period of time, although it may have been confusing for you in certain ways, it's also likely activated that creative drive. And you've been gaining some very powerful creative ideas and ambitions and aspirations. And you may have been responding to all the great changes with even more of a focused drive, with willpower and working yourself very, very hard. Now that Venus is in Aries along with Neptune, hopefully, as Venus is now applying to that trine with Mars, you are finding ways to restore more of a balance between working really hard and your health, and coming up with some innovative solutions to any ways you have been working yourself too hard with your energy, or just finding ways to bring in some daily routines and health habits that are going to give you more energy, because it's very likely that you have been gaining some very powerful ideas to get really excited about with your work in the world. And these can be big ideas right now that are going to be all part of how the world is going to be changing in the next couple of years very dramatically, and your life also will be as well. So I hope you get some very powerful revelations about how you've been changing, who you are right now, what you want, and what you want to do with your work in the world. Sagittarius, this full moon in Scorpio for you is more of a liminal one that could have to do with some deep inner changes going on within your psyche and mind, and mental explorations or spirituality, as well as any sort of grief that you've gone through in recent months with all these retrogrades and eclipses. There could be a cathartic expression of emotion as this full moon is in your 12th house. Now, Mars, as the Lord of the lunation, is in your ninth house and gaining speed and traction, and could be starting to generate lots of exciting new ideas at the same time that you're going to be very excited about pursuing with that powerful, active mind that you have. Or perhaps as you are a person that loves to travel and journey, there could be all sorts of exciting travel plans that you are also developing. And if it's not actual literal travel, it is likely journeying of the mind in one way or another. Now, the Scorpio full moon is forming that flowing trine aspect with Saturn in Pisces. Ever since March of 2023, Saturn has been moving across your fourth house of Pisces. And so this full moon is also illuminating something about some final lessons you're gaining from this initial pass of Saturn through your fourth house. Likely this has something to do with your home, whether you have had to move or remodel or do some sort of important work or renovation, some sort of foundational focus on your life. This also could have had to do with just your own inner psyche and unconscious and deeper awareness coming there, or issues related to your parents, whether they are aging or getting older, or just deep realizations about your relationship with them and how that has been affecting you. Whatever the case may be, Saturn is now getting closer to entering Aries and your fifth house. And that's where you have been adjusting to the presence of Neptune in Aries, as well as the recent entrance of Venus back into Aries. And so now that Venus is coming back to that place where she's stationed retrograde back at the beginning of March in your fifth house, there's also likely something major coming up for you this right at this time as we come into this full moon, relating to your creativity or your passions, that creative drive you have. And hopefully this full moon, in this liminal way that it's activating some deep recesses of your mind and dreams, this can then feed into your relationship with your creativity and creative direction. And something very powerful could be emerging at this time as you gain a deeper sense of the new desires that are beginning to emerge out of this process, and how that can feed into your creativity and your work in the world. Capricorn, this full moon in Scorpio is happening in your 11th house. I love this for you, Capricorn, because it speaks to greater community, greater alliances, people coming into your life who can be of greater support or inspiration, perhaps even collaboration. You are known for being able to take care of business and often taking care of things for other people. So hopefully this full moon in Scorpio will be opening up some new community networks of support or just very powerful alliances. At the very least, it's going to be illuminating your ambitions, your aspirations, and the way whatever new desires have been emerging for you are now feeding into what you want to do with your work in the world. Now, this full moon is also forming that trine to Saturn in Pisces. And ever since March of 2023, Saturn in Pisces has been moving across your third house. And we're now coming to the end of that first initial pass. And there's been a lot of intensity coming into this third house area for you. Of course, that could relate to siblings, old friends, and just the local environment with where you have been living. But as I've spoken to you in some past videos, I've also been very curious about how writing and communication and being able to express more of what you need and the way there could be some really interesting ideas coming through for you could have been emerging in this time period. And so that also might be really illuminated here for you. Now, Saturn is your planet, and Saturn is getting ready by the end of this lunation cycle on May 24th to come into Aries and come into your fourth house. Neptune's already in your fourth house. Venus has come back to your fourth house and is now approaching that degree where she's stationed retrograde at the beginning of March. There could be something about where you live, where you want to live, that is now getting illumination and you're becoming more sure about, or perhaps it's very creative innovations that you want to be doing or remodeling in your home. But of course, the fourth house can also just relate to really foundational aspects of our psyche and unconscious and inner life. And so there's definitely something really deep going on here for you. And this also even makes me think about Mars moving through Leo in your eighth house, which can also be a place of deep psyche. Now, that also can be a place of shared resources with others. And so that could also speak to the collaborations with others or important alliances you have with other people at this time. But there also seems like there is just something really deep that's going on with you right now that's being illuminated, that's then going to feed into these greater aspirations that you have for your work in the world. With that entrance of Saturn into Aries, there's something important that's going to be happening here in relation to your home or to your parents, or perhaps there's even something very vital about your ancestors and some ancestral patterns that are very strongly connected with the way things are going to be changing. This is a really powerful alignment that's coming with Saturn coming into Aries and being with Neptune in your fourth house. And so you are on a precipice of a major shift and turning point in your life as Saturn comes into this angular sign, especially since you are a sign of Saturn. So there's going to be some really big illumination and insights in this full moon that's going to be all part of how your life is going to be changing in big ways in the coming months. Aquarius, this full moon is in your 10th whole sign house. And so there is something powerful about who you are and your work in the world being illuminated right now. In the week before this full moon, Pluto stationed retrograde in your sign. And so there is likely something very deep on these deep inner layers of psyche with Mercury, the sun, and Uranus down there in your fourth house that is feeding into some kind of illumination which is going to show up with big changes going on with your work in the world, or at the very least, very inventive, innovative ideas about that. Since Mars rules the full moon and Mars is moving in Leo in your seventh house and is now breaking free into some new zodiacal terrain in your seventh house, there also could be some really powerful relationships and changes going on there with your contracts or just associations with other people that could be very activating and could also be part of driving you into this powerful new creative direction. This full moon in Scorpio is also forming a flowing trine with Saturn in Pisces. And ever since March of 2023, Saturn has been moving across your second house of Pisces. There very well could have been a lot of financial concerns, anxieties, or just financial pressure recently. Of course, that's just something that's been going on in the world in general, but Saturn has been shaping and honing and focusing you and kind of forcing you out of necessity to bring your awareness to finances or the way you make money or different financial habits or attitudes about money. And so in the way this full moon is very much all about who you are, your work in the world, your relationships. I mean, all four angles of your chart have something very powerful going on with them at this full moon. This is then going to be also feeding into some sort of new awareness that's coming in here about your finances. Now, Venus is back in Aries, Neptune is in Aries, and Saturn is getting close to entering Aries. And so it also looks like there is an important new storyline coming in here related to communication, writing, speaking, also how you show up in your local environment, your local community. Of course, this could also just speak to sibling relationships, old family relationships, family friends. But I think there's probably something really important about your communication and some sort of changes going on there that whatever that innovation that's going on relating to your work, it's also going to be very strongly connected to these third house topics of communication, writing. Perhaps it's using social media in some way as part of this as well, or other new technologies with the internet. Pisces, this full moon in Scorpio is in your ninth house with the Sun and Uranus and Mercury in your third house of Taurus. This is a full moon for you that definitely has somewhat of a liminal quality, something of the mystical or of great mental exploration, perhaps some very exciting new ideas coming in that you can further develop or perhaps pursue through a new course of studies or something else related to esoteric divination, mystical types of subjects, spirituality, or it could also just be illuminating travel plans, ideas about journeys, literal journeys of traveling to other places, as well as, of course, journeys of the mind. At the same time, that full moon in Scorpio is forming a flowing trine to Saturn in Pisces. And ever since March of 2023, Saturn in Pisces has been moving across your first house and fundamentally changing and altering and testing and honing who you are in the world. There are so many places of adversity and testing and challenges that you've been facing in the last couple of years. And whatever the lessons have been, this is a great full moon to try to take a step back and really take in all the ways you've faced adversity, all the ways you've gained greater maturity, all the ways you've been laying down this foundation of change and some new platform or foundation to build a great work with in your life. At the same time, Jupiter is still moving forward in Gemini through your fourth house. And so it also makes me think of how whatever these changes could be with that Saturn movement through your first, it's very foundational in some way and also could be part of something that's been growing and expanding and changing in relation to where you live or your home environment, or perhaps it's just something very profound about your own inner life and subconscious. Now, Venus is back in Aries, about to finally move past a degree where she's stationed retrograde back in March. Neptune is now in Aries, and you're getting close to having Saturn enter Aries and your second house. And so, the second house of finances, financial habits, your attitudes about money, how you make money, these are topics that are up right now for you. And I think right now, before we get to the entrance of Saturn into Aries, it's going to be really important to take stock of that because Saturn is going to come in there. And if there's things that you haven't been paying attention relating to your finances and money, Saturn's going to be bringing your attention to it. I do think there's hopefully going to be something very creative in some way, something coming in with this combination of Venus and Neptune in Aries that can hopefully help you think of some innovative, creative ways to work with your financial situation, whatever it may be. However, as part of that, you need to stay grounded and realistic. And so if you haven't been, make sure that you start bringing awareness to it because otherwise, Saturn coming into Aries and into your second house is going to be a very sobering reminder of what you haven't been paying attention to relating to your finances. Now, over time, this movement of Saturn in Aries that's coming, it can be a time where you can be slowly, steadily building greater financial resources, more stable or enduring financial habits. And so I'm not saying that the entrance of Saturn into Aries is going to wreck your finances. It just means you're going to have to bring attention to it. And so this is a good time now to get ahead of the game and make sure that you are already starting to develop whatever plans are needed to address whatever is going on there. Aries, this full moon in Scorpio is in your eighth house with the sun and Uranus in your second house. So there very well could be something very strongly related to your finances as well as shared resources, especially if you are married or have a particular partner or significant business partner, collaboration in some way of a lot of financial entanglement and shared resources. Something about that is likely to be illuminated here. Of course, the eighth house is also a place of deep psyche and these deep inner layers of who we are. And that full moon in Scorpio is forming a flowing trine to Saturn in Pisces, who is in your 12th house. And Saturn, ever since March of 2023, has been moving across your 12th house, which also speaks to these deep inner patterns, these deep places of psyche, these deep places that could have taken you to moments of isolation or alienation or separation, but there's also likely been great self realization, great maturity, perhaps even some spiritual awakenings that have occurred for you over the course of this Saturn and Pisces journey. And later at the end of this lunation cycle on May 24th, Saturn will be coming into Aries, into your first house. And this is going to be a major change. Now, at the full moon, Venus is in Aries with Neptune in Aries, and Venus is getting close to moving beyond the place where she's stationed retrograde at the beginning of March. And so, really, to me, most likely the most important thing about this full moon that's going to be the most obvious to you is coming into deeper presence and awareness of how you have been changed by this Venus retrograde transit, because Venus will be continuing to move across your first house during the rest of this lunation cycle, and she will be coming into a flowing trine aspect with Mars and Leo, who is the Lord of this full moon. And Mars in Leo is in your fifth house of pleasure, passion, creativity. And so there is likely some new sense of creativity and desire that can be brought into your work that can be emerging with this full moon in Scorpio. And so I hope you get some very powerful revelations regarding that. Taurus, this full moon in Scorpio is major for you. Because the full moon in Scorpio is in your seventh house, this may have a lot to do with a partner or a particular relationship. It also may just have to do with a lot of different relationships in your life or a lot more social activity and busyness coming into your life. The full moon is, of course, opposite Uranus. You've had Uranus in Taurus in your first house ever since 2018. Our experience of Uranus and Taurus is not over with this full moon, but it is going to be the last full moon to activate Uranus and Taurus. And you've had a lot of those. I'm sure you have many stories you can tell about the different full moons and Scorpios and solar eclipses in Taurus and the total lunar eclipses in Scorpio that were setting off Uranus during these past 8 years. So there's likely some sort of big, not necessarily final lesson with Uranus and Taurus, but definitely some sort of culminating experience that's very important relating to this longer term story of the way Uranus and Taurus has been changing your life. But even more importantly is Saturn in Pisces coming to the end of its transit, because by the end of this lunation cycle, Saturn will no longer be in Pisces, but will be in Aries. And so that full moon forming that trine to Saturn in Pisces in your 11th house is very big. Ever since March of 2023, Saturn in Pisces has been in your 11th house. And so there's something major that's been going on for you, not just the way you've been changing with Uranus and Taurus, but how that has fed into your community and your alliances and your ambitions and aspirations in the world. And there might have been a lot more pressure that's been coming there recently. But hopefully, whatever the case has been for you relating to that, and the Venus retrograde and the Mercury retrograde and so on, this Scorpio full moon is hopefully illuminating something for you about these important collaborations, alliances, community work that you've been part of. And hopefully, you are experiencing lessons and awareness of the ways you've grown in this area of your life. There's probably some very beautiful things about this work and community that you've been doing with Saturn and Pisces to really take in about yourself and take stock of how that's been developing for you. Now, with Mars in Leo down in your fourth house, and that Mars being the ruling planet, Mars moving away from that opposition with Pluto, there's also something about that Mars-Pluto opposition that was building for so long in your 10th and 4th house, something about home and work and inner life versus outer life, which is also likely being illuminated here for you. And there's something about that Mars in Leo moving through new ground now in the 4th house. So something about your home or that inner life, or even something about your parents, where something is really coming in there now to get a better sense of how this is all playing out now with the way the changes have been taking shape over the past recent months. You still have a little bit of time of Jupiter in Gemini in your 2nd house. And so another element of this could also be illuminating some ways of that Jupiter in your 2nd house transit, bringing in some additional financial opportunities. And so there also could be something illuminated about how you have been in relation with that Jupiter and Gemini transit in your 2nd house. And it could relate to some new opportunities coming in financially, or at least ways of adjusting to all the great economic uncertainty and changes that have been going on in the world. The other thing I haven't mentioned is Aries, your 12th house. So Neptune is in Aries now. Venus has passed through a conjunction with Neptune and is now at this full moon, getting close to passing over that degree where she stationed retrograde back at the beginning of March. Venus will then be moving into a trine with Mars over the course of the waning half of this lunation cycle. That combination of Venus and Aries in your 12th, Mars in your 4th, again makes me think of this inner life. And while there is a lot of busyness with your relationships and your community that's going on right now, there's something really rich and powerful taking shape within you that you're going to need to pay attention to. Whatever that is, it's going to be part of the meaning of Saturn entering Aries on May 24th and coming into your 12th house. So hopefully there'll be some important realizations and revelations that will be helpful for you. Gemini, the full moon in Scorpio is in your 6th house with the sun and Uranus, as well as Mercury in your 12th house, with the Lord of the lunation, Mars, in your 3rd house, moving away from an opposition with Pluto and Aquarius, who is in your 9th house. And in the past week, remember, Pluto stationed retrograde in your 9th house. With all of your cadent houses so activated at this full moon, it makes me think of something dramatically liminal going on. You are a sign that has had so much activity and so much busyness and perhaps so much going on, too much going on. Jupiter and Gemini bringing all of these opportunities and all these different things you can do. And Saturn in Pisces bring all this weight to your 10th house work and your career. And Venus and Neptune activating all of these aspirations and perhaps community ideals and new dreams coming in. And so there's likely been a lot of different activity going on. And so the full moon activating these cadent houses makes me think about the importance of getting some space to yourself and going within, that there is some sort of deep check-in here about how this activity has been impacting your health, has been impacting your physical health, as well as your mental health. What kind of practices can you put into place, daily regimens that can help you cope with all the busyness you've been going through? Perhaps you need to take more of a break, do more things to help you calm and center. Now, at the same time, with Mars now in that 3rd house and moving into new zodiacal terrain and away from that opposition with Pluto, and with Venus and Aries in the 11th house coming into a trine with Mars and Leo in your 3rd house, and you being a Gemini, you being a child of Mercury, and a child and person and soul of communication and great mental thought, there is also likely something very intellectually stimulating going on with a combination of Mars and Pluto in your 3rd and 9th. And especially with Mars there, it makes me think of writing, speaking, some sort of important growth and drive coming into this communication area. It also could have something to do with your local environment and opportunities coming up there in your local community. And what's really powerful about that is it makes me feel how the local community with Mars and Leo there is being connected into this much broader, greater community and alliances that goes with the Venus and Aries in your 11th house. And so there likely is going to be some illumination here regarding your work and new opportunities coming in, new collaborations and new ideas that can really feed in and enliven that work in the world. Whatever has been going on for you and whatever pressure you've been facing, this is a good time to take stock of this long Saturn and Pisces journey you have experienced with Saturn moving across your 10th whole sign house. That full moon in Scorpio is forming a flowing trine to Saturn and Pisces. And ever since March of 2023, Saturn has been moving across your 10th house. And that weight of Saturn and the North Node in Pisces recently combined with the Venus retrograde, the Mercury retrograde, the eclipses, it may have gotten too much at times, just feeling like there's so much to do and so much you're needing to take on. Whatever you have experienced, this is a great time to take stock and look back at how much has changed. Most likely, you have really experienced tremendous growth and maturation and realizations about your work in the world and who you want to be. And so, this is a good time just to reflect upon the ways you've been reshaped by the Saturn and Pisces transit. Whatever is going on for you with that Venus and Neptune in your 11th house, that's also going to be important because Saturn is going to be coming into that 11th house. And there can be some important tests coming in there, but also realized manifestations of development and growth. And while there could be some Saturn pressure brought into community and alliances and aspirations, there's also going to be the ability with Saturn to really build and lay a really solid foundation there. There's going to be big changes coming for you in the next couple of years with the way the astrology is playing out with your chart, Gemini. And so, since this full moon in Scorpio is in the 6th and the 12th, I think it's a really important check in with how these drives and these new opportunities have been affecting your health and figuring out how to bring more of a balance there. And how can you bring in some either exercise or meditation or different practices or different routines that can bring more of a healthy balance to restore your energy and get ready for another big wave of change to be coming through your life in the season ahead. Cancer, this full moon in Scorpio is in your 5th house with Mercury, the Sun, and Uranus and Taurus in your 11th house. This can be a very exciting full moon for you in many ways because it is in that 5th house of pleasure, passion, creativity. Of course, if you have children or you work with children, the topic of children, it could relate to that. But likely, this is going to bring in some big revelations regarding your passions and creativity and the new creative direction and drive that is emerging for you out of this big period of massive changes that we've all been going through. That Scorpio full moon is applying to a flowing trine aspect with Saturn and Pisces in your 9th house. And ever since March of 2023, Saturn has been moving across Pisces through your whole sign 9th house. This is another big factor to take into account. How has Saturn been reshaping this area of your life? This could relate to all sorts of 9th house topics, whether that is studies, formal studies you've been taking on, or perhaps you yourself has been a teacher, or perhaps you've been exploring other cultures or traveling to other cultures, traveling to foreign cultures, or going on more of a great journey of the mind, whether that is intellectual, mental pursuits, or great spiritual realizations and awakenings. Whatever the case has been for you, take in the way these things have been changed for you since this time of Saturn in Pisces, because Saturn is getting close by the end of this lunar cycle on May 24th to entering Aries and coming into your 10th house. Now, that 10th whole sign house for you is also very active with Neptune in Aries there now and Venus in Aries getting ready to go past that degree where she stationed retrograde back at the beginning of March. However, you've been reshaped by this powerful Mars retrograde that was in Cancer in your 1st house earlier, and the Venus retrograde, the Mercury retrograde, and everything else. There is now a new sense of your creative drives and desires and how that is feeding into your work in the world. And so I hope you experience some very powerful revelations and realizations about that. Since Mars is in Leo in your 2nd house, I do think there could be some important awareness needing to also be taken into your financial situation. Now, this could come in with new financial opportunities and things to really kind of go after, focus your energy on that could perhaps make some more money for you. But otherwise, also just make sure you're paying attention to that area of your life with Mars moving through that section of your chart in this period ahead. Leo, the full moon in Scorpio is in your fourth house with the sun and Uranus, as well as Mercury and Taurus in your 10th house. This is a full moon taking you into your inner depths. And with Pluto having recently stationed in your seventh house and Mars in Leo having moved through that opposition with Pluto in your first house, this full moon is really activating the angles of your chart and looks to be very impactful for you. Now, this could have something to do, like I said, with your inner life, unconscious, subconscious, deep inner emotional patterns, something connected back even with childhood or in relation to your parents. It could even be something that's even on a larger ancestral, like ancestor level there. And with Pluto having stationed retrograde recently in your seventh house, there's also maybe something just regarding relationships in general and relationship patterns that has been activated. And then this full moon in Scorpio activating a deeper layer of yourself and how that's been coming into these relationship patterns and realizations you've been having about yourself. Mars in Leo, though, in your first house is just such a big factor in everything going on. Now, of course, last November in 2024, Mars first came into Leo. Mars stationed retrograde in December of last year, then went back into Cancer, and in January of 2025 was in Cancer then all the way up until mid to late April when Mars finally came back into Leo. And now Mars has broken free into some new zodiacal terrain beyond where Mars stationed retrograde last December. And so, whatever you have gone through in relation to this long Mars retrograde transit, there is likely something very generative and hopefully clarifying that's going to really help you focus your willpower now on making some meaningful changes and getting a deeper awareness of how you have been changed by this powerful Mars retrograde transit that's been affecting you. At the same time, there has been the Venus retrograde transit, and Venus is now moving direct in your ninth house of Aries, with Neptune also there in Aries. And so, as part of the way things have been changing for you with this Mars transit, there also might be some very exciting mental ideas or spiritual realizations or interests that you're starting to develop about new studies that you can have or pursuits of learning or something else in these ninth house domain of various topics. The other thing, of course, about this full moon in Scorpio is that it is forming a flowing trine aspect with Saturn in Pisces. And Saturn in Pisces, ever since March of 2023, has been moving across your eighth house. Saturn moving across your eighth house is not exactly an easy transit. In some ways, this could have brought up some big issues and tests you've had to face with shared resources, whether that's with been a primary partner or just other important relationships in your life in which you have some sort of shared financial relationship or different investments that you have, or perhaps in your work, you work with other people's resources in some sort of significant way. Whatever the case has been, there's been a lot of pressure brought to this area of your life. And as I mentioned, the full moon in Scorpio in the fourth house could be thought of in one way as really illuminating these deep layers of psyche in your inner life. We could also say the same thing about Saturn and Pisces in your eighth house. And so, whatever you have had to face with Saturn in Pisces, this is a good full moon just to reflect upon it, think about the way things have been changing for you, I'm sure there's been all sorts of important growth and lessons and self realization that you've gained through the experience. There's going to be a notable shift when Saturn finally gets out of your eighth house and moves into your ninth house on May 24th. But for now, just take in how that Venus and Neptune combination is already starting to activate those ninth house topics, because the entrance of Saturn in there later this month is going to bring more focus there and more potential to really manifest something tangible out of these great mental or spiritual, whatever it might be that's going on for you related to that ninth house. And so hopefully this full moon in Scorpio will be very revelatory for you, with putting you in touch with some really powerful new ideas and insights for you. Virgo, the full moon in Scorpio is in your third house, with the sun and Uranus in your ninth house, along with Mercury. This is a full moon for you, like the other mutable signs, that is more liminal, because the full moon, as well as Mars ruling the full moon and Pluto, who just stationed this past week, they're all in these cadent houses, which can be more about deep layers of the mind and inner psyche in some ways. The full moon in Scorpio, though, in your third house, does make me think a lot about writing, communication, and all these types of skills that you, as a Virgo, being the sign of Mercury, likely possess and utilize in one way or another. This also, of course, could relate to just your local environment and community you live in, as well as old friends you have or siblings. But I think it likely has something to do with whatever mental ideas or studies or spiritual awareness or realizations you've been having, and something really coming through with some deeper insights and revelations about that. And you may, especially if you are a writer or do something in the communication fields or media fields, this could really be enlivening and insightful for your work. Now, the full moon in Scorpio is forming that flowing trine aspect with Saturn in Pisces. And this is bringing attention to the fact that ever since March of 2023, Saturn has been in Pisces in your seventh house. You've likely been facing some sort of adversity or challenge or testing or pressure in the realm of relationships, whether that has been a significant romantic relationship or friendship that has ended or just had some difficulty to work through, or perhaps it's had to do with just a lot of different relationships in general that have had some sort of testing and pressure. It also could have related to making some very serious commitments and devotions within relationships, and some very long-term relationships coming in that have been building steadily and you now are realizing are going to be really part of your life going forward. Whatever it is, it's going to be worth your time thinking about the way your life has changed with the Saturn and Pisces transit. Now, at the same time, Jupiter is still in Gemini, moving across your 10th house. And so although Jupiter in Gemini isn't really making a super strong aspect to this full moon, besides being in about a degree away from a quincunx with the full moon, you still have a stretch of this Jupiter in Gemini transit coming up in the month ahead. And so there's likely also still something important going on with your work in the world and some new opportunities coming in with that, that this full moon is in some way going to be illuminating some important realizations about. But like again, it could likely have to do with your studies or even researching or mentally exploring or spiritually devoting yourself to in one way or another. Now, the other thing that I haven't mentioned is Venus. So Venus is in Aries along with Neptune right now, and she is getting close to coming back to that degree where she's stationed retrograde at the beginning of March. So just how Saturn could be calling a lot of attention to that seventh place of relationships, there's also a way that if you are in a relationship of shared resources with somebody else, or there's ways that you work with people in with with other people's money in some way, there's a combination of these two things where Venus and Neptune right now are activating something related to this and the shared resources. And whatever that is, just pay attention to it, because once Saturn comes into Aries on May 24th, it's going to get more real, and you're going to be needing to pay more attention to that, whatever it is. Now, it doesn't need to be all negative. There could be something really solid you end up building there, but you're going to need to bring your attention to that area of your life. Hopefully, though, I really hope this is going to be a really exciting full moon for you mentally, and you can use those amazing mental skills you have to develop some really powerful ideas. Libra, this full moon in Scorpio is in your second house of finances with the sun in Taurus, Uranus in Taurus, and Mercury in Taurus in your eighth house. That can also be financial. That can be a house of shared resources. So something powerful seems to be going on here related to finances, related to the way that's connected in with other people's money, whether that's a primary partnership of shared resources or different associations, collaborations you have, or you just work in some kind of line of work involving organizing or managing other resources. Something there is very active and alive here. Now, this also makes me think, though, about Mars being the lord of the lunation and being in your 11th house and now breaking into some new zodiacal terrain, moving away now from that opposition with Pluto and moving beyond the place where Mars stationed retrograde previously. I think there's also something coming in here very powerfully about your aspirations in the world, alliances you have, community that you want to be building. And there could be some important connection with that in with this financial situation that might be getting illuminated here. Now, this full moon in Scorpio is also forming a flowing trine to Saturn in Pisces. And this, of course, brings up the fact that Saturn is getting to the end of its time in Pisces, and Saturn has been in Pisces and been in your sixth whole sign house ever since March of 2023. Now, whatever you've had to deal with this Saturn and Pisces transit, it's going to be worth your time to think about that and reflect on it. For some of you, there could have been some sort of significant health issue you've faced, but in one way or another, there has been a lot of pressure brought in here to this place of daily work, daily regimens, health habits, places where you really toil and work. And so, hopefully, if you have had some sort of health issue, there's been some important insights coming in with how to deal with that. Now, because this full moon is in Scorpio in your second, and it is forming that trine to Saturn and Pisces in your sixth, this also could be bringing in some important insights just about your job, where you work, what you do for a living. And especially if it has been a job that isn't the most fulfilling for you, you might also be getting a sense of how you would like to change that or what you would like to be doing differently. There is going to be a big transit of Jupiter eventually coming into Cancer and into your 10th whole sign house later in June. And so there really can ultimately be some big changes going on with your work. And so if you're getting realizations now about what's not working for you and what you want to change, use that Mars in Leo in your 11th house transit to really start generating some momentum and drive towards more of what you want to be doing for work and doing to make money. The other big thing going on is Venus and Aries in your seventh house, with Neptune and Aries in your seventh house. So you had Venus station retrograde in your seventh house back in March. And over the course of that retrograde, something very profound has likely happened for you with relationships, whether you've had important relationships where you had some tests and adversity you had to face. In some cases, there might have been a relationship that ended. In other cases, there might have been really new, exciting relationships coming into your life. For some of you, it might have been more just a lot of exposure of different relationship patterns that you have or new relationship needs that you've come into contact with and relationship desires. Whatever the case may be, as Venus is now coming back to that degree where she originally stationed retrograde, there's going to be some major awareness and greater clarity coming in there. And so that could also be part of what this full moon in Scorpio is illuminating for you. And keep in mind that whatever is going on in that place of relationship for you, Saturn will be coming into Aries on May 24th. And so there's going to be some real big changes and development and growth that's going to be coming into this area of relationship for you. And so, however, you're already noticing things are starting to change there with that Venus and Neptune contact, it might be more of a sense of the ideal right now. And so, as you get into a sense of that ideal of relationship and the way you would like your relationships to be changing, hopefully, once Saturn comes into Aries, you can use that awareness to make some real tangible, concrete changes there that can be better for you. If you'd like to explore more deeply how your life is changing in relationship with the dramatic astrology of the next year, my books are open for astrology consultations right now. I will put a link below in the description so you can book a session with me. I'll also put a link below to my Patreon community. I have an active Patreon. There's additional material and videos that I post there that I don't share elsewhere, as well as discounts on working with me that you can gain by joining my Patreon. There's also 2 different monthly meetings that happen depending upon what tier you join. So please check that out. Also, if you have not yet liked or subscribed to my YouTube channel, please do, as that really helps me out. Thanks for listening. I hope you take in the potency of this full moon in Scorpio in ways that leads to powerful revelations about the new creative directions that are emerging for you now out of this period of extraordinary change that we've gone through in recent months.